this session. I'm very pleased to welcome you all back and to introduce to you one of our most recently appointed staff members, Senior Lecturer Dr. Yvette Maker. Now, Yvette has a background both in law and social policy, and so that's why she's really perfectly equipped to talk to you about your topic today. Now, as well as that, in the law faculty, she coordinates what we call our clinical legal education units. The students in their third year can take units where they actually go out into legal practice. So we use a kind of medical term of clinical legal education, but the idea is you go and gain legal skills in legal practice. And Yvette also coordinates that program. Now, she has a really wide-ranging experience in all sorts of things outside of the law. And I think you were there this morning when Gino spoke about the fact that the law is connected to so many other fields, and you really are the living example of that. Because Yvette has researched, investigated, and policy roles, including in bodies such as the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Yvette has also assisted the chair of the UN Committee for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So a really wide-ranging types of work. Yvette has also recently published a really important book with Cambridge University Press. The book's called Care and Support for Rights After Neoliberalism, Balancing Competing Claims in Policies and Law. So you could not have a better person. So please welcome Yvette. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking Yvette some questions. We've also had some wonderful questions from Hobart College, and we'll get to those. And then I'll also invite you to put up your hand and ask some questions. But I'm interested in starting really with a kind of bird's eye view. We heard a little bit about that this morning. Why are we talking about law when we're concerned about aged care? Where does law come in?
Sure. So the simple answer to that question, I suppose, is that law comes into it via the Aged Care Act of 1997, which is a Commonwealth piece of legislation, obviously quite old now in the scheme of things. And we talk about legislation in that context essentially for a couple of reasons. One is that aged care, particularly aged care in residential facilities, so where people live together in groups of potentially dozens of older people, so often with separate or shared rooms, but common living, dining, bathroom areas, and where people have nursing care and other kinds of aged care support in that environment. We're essentially putting people in a situation that's sort of separate from the rest of the community. Maybe we're not interacting with people in that environment as much, or only a small number of people are interacting with them, which creates vulnerabilities for those people in terms of how they're treated, what their lives are like, and so on. And so that's sort of one of the reasons why we speak about law in terms of legal protections for people in that environment. And then I suppose the other reason we do is because aged care is a responsibility of the Commonwealth Government. So the Commonwealth Government provides most of the funding for aged care, although to an extent and to varying degrees, individuals and families pay for aged care services themselves as well. But we have this legislative framework or this regulatory regime to set the boundaries around which kinds of services and facilities can get that government funding, what conditions they need to meet to be continually eligible for the funding in terms of the quality of the services they provide, and in terms of things like reporting, so what they need to tell the government about what they spend money on, about who lives in their facilities, the conditions that they live in, the care that they get, and all of that sort of thing. So that's, I guess, the main reasons why we are interested in the law in this area. And then, as I spoke about in the video lecture for this one, on that point of protections, the Aged Care Royal Commission and other inquiries in recent years have really raised the possibility, I suppose, that the legal protections that we have in the Aged Care Act are not adequate, and that a lot of people are not living in good conditions and are potentially subject to quite serious violence and forms of abuse in those settings. And so that's why we talk about the need for law reform at the moment in that area as well.
So there have been a lot of royal commissions and other inquiries. Someone saw a picture of someone had a sort of whole stack of reports over the last 15 years. Why is it so difficult to get it right?
Good question. Again, a couple of things. It's very expensive to provide care and support to anyone. That is just a very costly thing to do. It's something that doesn't lend itself very well to what would normally be sort of efficiencies. So cost cutting and so on is really difficult when you're meeting people's basic sort of needs for personal assistance, for food, for social life, for meaningful life and all those sorts of things. And so I think it's hard to get right, partly because anything that uses a lot of resources is always going to be politically complicated. There are a lot of, so that the people who provide aged care, that run aged care facilities, it's a real mixed bag of for-profit providers. So there are quite a few organisations who are in the aged care game to make a profit. Others are non-profit providers, so charitable organisations, not-for-profit bodies and so on. And so it's also just sort of a complicated area with lots of different interests and lots of sort of competing interests in terms of different views about the best way to run things, about where funding should go and what it should be used for. And I think there's also an element there of what I mentioned before, that we don't hear a lot from the people living in those facilities. So even in the Aged Care Royal Commission, very few people themselves who use those services were witnesses, gave evidence. We mostly hear from people's families, from workers and others who are kind of aware of what's happening in people's lives. But I think also because we don't hear from people directly, that means that perhaps change is slower and we're less aware of what's going on and what might need to change.
That's that particular vulnerability, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I'm going to just ask you, not a constitutional question, but what's interesting to me is, so we've got this area where there's government funding, there's different type of providers and there are regulations. How are these regulations divided between state and Commonwealth responsibility? Is that a mixed bag?
Yeah, so it's essential, my understanding, it's changed over time and it's definitely not my area of expertise, but my understanding is it's still largely Commonwealth responsibility. It's complicated. So the Commonwealth's responsible for aged care. The states and territories are responsible for disability services and for mental health services, but we do find a certain proportion of older people who also have mental health conditions or diagnoses, and there are some aged care facilities that are mental health aged care facilities, and so then you run into complications about who is responsible, the feds or the states, for what element of it. And one of the reasons the Royal Commission, the Aged Care Royal Commission came about was because of a particularly shocking story of a man who was in one of those combined facilities, and it was just not a facility that was fit for people to be living in, and the conditions were not good, and he eventually died in that environment with injuries and so on. And I think it's a contested question, I guess, is who's responsible.
That's right.
And we definitely see
pass the buck a little bit.
Right, and so we see those times where perhaps that affects funding and the running of services where everyone says someone else is responsible.
Yeah. So unbelievably complex. Is that what you found in your studies? That this is a complex area to get your head around? It's not easy to work out who is responsible for making sure that people in aged care have a good quality of life and are well looked after. So what about the Royal Commission? Is it going to make a difference?
Good question as well. It has already made a difference, at least to the law. So again, in the area that I spoke about in the video lecture, in the regulation of restrictive practices, so where people might be, mostly in aged care, at situations where people might be strapped to their bed or strapped into a wheelchair, or they might be given sedation or some psychiatric medication to make them sleepy and compliant and not move around and so on. So this we call restrictive practices. In that area, there was a lot of concern that it wasn't mentioned at all in the Aged Care Act. There was some policy and some guidelines for aged care services about when they could use these practices and what for, but they didn't have to sort of report to the government to say when they were using them. There aren't remedies if people think that they've been used inappropriately against them and so on, and then there are coronial reports where people have died from these practices, as well as people reporting that they're painful, that they're traumatising, and staff reporting that that it's not good for them either to be doing these things to other people. So we've seen the Aged Care Act since the Royal Commission and since the Royal Commission's recommendation being changed to to cover some of these things. There is now also a requirement since 2019 for aged care providers to report the use of some of these forms of restraint, so not the chemical ones, not the medications, but all the other forms. So where people are held down, for example, or strapped down, that now needs to be reported, and that is then publicly available information from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. It's a little bit early to say that there are some indications that the use of the practices might be declining. So I think we're still to find out the effect of the Royal Commission in that sense, and there are still, I mentioned a little bit, but something that might be interesting for you to look at a bit more if you do want to do your essay on this topic. There's still some disagreement about whether those changes to the law are good or good enough. So different people will have different views about whether the reforms are adequate, but I think certainly the overarching theme of the Royal Commission's recommendations that we don't currently have a system that recognises people's rights and provides them with good life is promising. And they did set out the specifics of legislation to achieve that. And we've had now 2 pieces of legislation be passed by Parliament to make some changes to the Aged Care Act, and I think we'll see in the next couple of years what they do in practice.
Yes. So I might turn to one of the questions from Hobart College, which kind of goes to that, because one of the things that occurs when you're listening to you is about the new practices, is they might have implications for staffing, that you in fact need more staff to be able to perhaps wash someone or feed someone without restraining them. And so the first question from Hobart College is what changes should be implemented in terms of carers, patient carer ratios, staffing levels, legislations to protect carers from exploitation, and also to ensure that they have adequate training to meet expectations.
Very good question, thank you. It might partly be because I'm a policy and a law person, so I'm as interested in the implementation of the law as the letter of the law, I suppose. But certainly in this area, I think it's more about those kinds of things, resources and staffing, than it necessarily is about what is on paper in the legislation. We see that in other areas of the law, so disability and mental health services, where there has been regulation in legislation for a lot of years on the use of these practices. So these kinds of things and others are used on people in mental health inpatient wards and people with disability, particularly people with intellectual disability who live in what are often called group homes or use some sorts of disability services. They're also often subject to various kinds of restraints or seclusion, so being put in a room by yourself for long periods of time. And we've seen in those other areas that even where you have protections on paper, if there isn't training, so people know what to do, if there isn't enough staff to do it, then it just doesn't mean anything. So, and also the Aged Care Royal Commission heard from so many workers who are put in that unenviable position where they don't really have an option other than to do this. And they've very much called for things like staffing ratios, for higher numbers of staff, and for better training. There is part of the problem on the research side, I guess, is that there hasn't been a lot of information about what training would look like. There is more of that from mental health and disability services. There's now quite a lot of research and evidence that if you train staff on alternatives to restrictive practices, so what do you do basically so that you don't get to a point where someone is so agitated or aggressive that restrictive practices become the only option or the best option. How do you create environments where people are more comfortable and feel safe and don't feel restricted in those ways? We now have a lot of evidence that there are lots of things that you can do and that they're quite effective. But again, it requires people to be trained on how they work.
And also to be scheduled on in a way that they have sufficient time to spend with the person, not to watch 10 people in an hour, for example.
Right.
If you have that kind of schedule, that's tricky.
Absolutely. And so the Four Corners report that really kicked off the Royal Commission, someone spoke about having 6 minutes per resident to get them out of bed, help them shower, make sure they had breakfast and get them dressed. So it's just not possible at all. And like I say, it puts people who are not well paid, generally speaking, in an impossible position. And I think that's another reason the law reform questions here are really interesting, because it's not a matter of blaming individuals for doing particular actions. These actions are permitted in the law, and people are in a position where there's not too many choices about what to do, and so it really does then require some kind of change to the system for there to be alternatives.
And that change is more than just the legislative reform.
Absolutely.
It's impossible really to effect these changes just on paper.
Definitely, and it's all about the individuals and that sort of thing. I think that is one area where we'll see how far the Royal Commission implementation will go, because what is often called for is staffing ratios, so that patients or people living in aged care facilities have a certain number. So an individual worker is responsible for, say, 3 people on a shift.
And we have this in childcare, of course.
Right, and so at the moment the ratios might be 1 worker to 6 or 10 individuals, but maybe you would call for 1 worker to 2 or 3 individuals so that people can provide an adequate quality of care. I will be surprised if that is put into legislation. Again, because of the costs involved, it's the most expensive part of providing care and support for people, and unfortunately there are, as I say, those economic factors.
That's right. And
that push against that.
That's right, and we're thinking here of the fact that while some are provided by charitable organisations, a significant number of aged care facilities are run on a for-profit basis, and I presume it's a simple model that if the costs go up because you have to have new staff, you want to maintain your profit margin, then the cost of the entire enterprise, perhaps to individuals, will also go up.
Absolutely, and so those are the sorts of economic levers, I suppose, that are complicated, and that is one of the big sticking points at the moment with the government's reform process for implementing that, the Royal Commission's recommendations, is really the funding question. And just to make it even more complicated, the Royal Commission initially had 3 members. Unfortunately, the chair died during the course of the Royal Commission, leaving 2 commissioners, and they disagreed on many of their recommendations. And so large parts of their report are basically recommendations of 1 commissioner and another.
Which is quite unusual, isn't it? Mostly, of course, I've never seen it in any report, and the style of writing of the 2 commissioners is very, very different. You can see one is quite, and I recommend that you look at the report. It's definitely worth reading because it's written very clearly, and one of them is quite blunt about what's going on, and the other is a little bit perhaps more political and sort of, washes over things a little bit. But it is complicated when you don't have a clear recommendation.
That's right, and I think it also makes it easier for governments to perhaps not take recommendations on board if there's not a sort of particularly clear pathway through. So again, it remains to be seen how they'll work that out.
So before I go to another question that's already been provided, I wonder if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question. So we don't have microphones here, so we're going to kind of repeat the question for the purpose of the recording.
I kind of had 2 questions, if that's okay. I was wondering just about the funding. You said what your thoughts were on the introduced kind of funding structure in the new legislation that recently passed, and also I saw a lot of union and advocate group backlash that there wasn't enough introducing that legislation that would provide support for the working conditions of nursing staff, and whether you thought programs like what was recently introduced in Victoria is adequate bolstering of that kind of workforce.
Thank you. Okay, so one question about the funding model and whether it's adequate, and then a second question about pushback from unions and workers groups, is that right, about I guess working conditions, whether the changes so far are going to make an adequate difference, particularly to nurses' working conditions. Again, really great questions, thank you. I can't say a lot on the funding question. My brain doesn't do that kind of economic modelling type stuff, and I trust others with that expertise to comment on that. I guess from a policy point of view, I can comment that I think it's it's always going to be piecemeal in the sense that there are going to be what it looks like at the moment. There have been a few sort of report cards published by different organisations, sort of trying to give some overview of what's been done so far and what's working and what else the government needs to do. And they've certainly pointed out that the government has been kind of committing funding to specific programs, with the idea that overall they'll all start to build up together to make conditions better in aged care and so on. And so I think that's always going to be just without a kind of huge revamp of the whole system, you're always going to be trying to fill in gaps and things rather than perhaps doing anything major all at once. So I think that's part of the concern about funding, and I think that's just going to be a constant challenge. Because the other factor, of course, is that we have what's often termed an ageing population. So we have a higher proportion of older people in the years and decades to come, which means more and more people will need these services, which means more and more costs. So it's an ongoing kind of problem for government, or issue for government. I don't think it's a problem in the sense that I think care and support and making sure everyone has a meaningful life should be core business for all of us as a community and a society. But it remains that it is very expensive. The second element in terms of pushback from unions and workers, this kind of links in, I suppose, to broader issues of the undervaluing of care in our society. Again, feminist scholars particularly have argued for decades now that the kinds of care that people provide in aged care services, but also in hospitals and childcare and all these other places, is not viewed as sort of economically valuable. Generally, most of the people in that kind of work are women, definitely not all of them, but it's still very female dominated. It's not well paid compared to other work of similar skill levels. And so there's a long way to go, I think, to get to the point where that is valued adequately, which has flow-on effects. If it's low paid, then people are less inclined to take that kind of work. There is research that there's a direct correlation between how much, the working conditions and the quality of care that people can give. So technically paying better benefits the users as well as the workers. But I think that hasn't flowed through yet to sort of policy and law. In terms of what can be done about that, I certainly think incentive programs can be part of the solution in terms of making that sort of work more attractive to people. The way people are paid, the way pay is calculated, there's all these complications around that in terms of whether you get paid for travelling between one place and another place, and whether you get paid if you sleep overnight at a place, if some people need someone to be there 24/7. At the moment, generally people aren't paid for that kind of stuff. So there's all kinds of arguments and challenges going on around that. Things I think are getting better in some sectors, but it's slow progress as always.
Great question. Would someone else like to ask a question? Yes, please.
So I might be a little bit rough, I wrote another talk, but obviously saying final report recommendations of the Royal Commission to aged care. Done a little bit of research along with the Royal Commission, the main of course both Productivity Commission in 2011 and the Sustainable Reform Commission in 2019. We also partially investigated problems with aged care. With the new federal government only implemented 14 recommendations in their Royal Commission response bill, and including the controversial Schedule 9 clause in their Royal Commission response bill. How effective do you think the Royal Commission and the other government agencies concerned with law reform have been in the aged care law reform legislated?
Thank you.
Very well formulated question.
So the question is broadly, given that we've had a number of reviews in recent years, so the Productivity Commission about 10 years ago now, and then the Australian Law Reform Commission about 5 or fewer years ago, and then the Aged Care Royal Commission, and the limited progress so far on the implementation of reforms, what can we sort of say about their effectiveness? I think it's a good question. I suppose one way I can maybe give you some other food for thought on that is I have also looked at what's happening in this space in England, and I can say that it's been very similar in terms of, I think they had something like 14 review papers within a 10-year period. And similar sorts of things. So over there they were sort of white, so they have green papers and white papers and other kinds of committee inquiries and so on. I've had a lot of those in recent years. That has led to quite new and innovative legislation over there that unfortunately hasn't been implemented very well. But I think, so I've probably looked at that more closely than the Australian process. And I think the issue there that comes up, or there are a couple of them, one is the sort of short policy cycle that we're on these days. So you mentioned change of government. It does mean that things that might be started by one government may not be then carried through when there's a change of government. We find just that is to do with changes in policy direction and areas of concern and so on. I think again it comes back to a couple of the things we've already talked about in terms of it's really complicated, unfortunately. So it's, it probably does rely on just an accumulation of knowledge and reform options over time that you're eventually getting closer and closer to a solution. But I think you've probably hit on one of the kind of frustrations of more reform processes, that they can be kind of big and expensive and they can make these wonderful recommendations, but the challenge is in the implementation, which often results in, like I said, sort of governments picking things to focus on and narrowing in on those and making some really great progress on particular issues, but perhaps the broader stuff gets less attention, the broader kind of system stuff. And so I think there's still a lot of promise from the Aged Care Royal Commission report in terms of things changing. And again, the example of restrictive practices and this being an opportunity to really improve things. And I think I will say, I think with the new government, aged care and care generally is going to be on the agenda and stay on the agenda, and hopefully having something like that report as a focal point gives some momentum to that reform. Particularly because, broadly speaking, the recommendations of the Aged Care Royal Commission were consistent with those prior ones broadly. So hopefully it's all building towards something. So I hope that's helpful.
Anyone else?
Sorry, I read some local articles voicing concerns that the recent Victorian announcement of free uni degrees for nurses would kind of leach our industry a little bit, make it so that we have less nurses available. Is that something you're concerned about?
Yeah, so there was an announcement, I think it was this week, from the Victorian government that they're going to sponsor, I think, 10,000 nursing degrees as a way to deal with shortages in that sector. And then there was a follow-up report about concerns that would mean people would leave Tasmania and it would affect shortages that we already have here. In terms of aged care, the majority of the workforce aren't nurses. They are mostly support workers or aged care workers of some kind, so they don't necessarily have a nursing qualification. So there are legislative requirements, again, about the number of people who need to be in facilities, and it's sort of a smaller number of nurses compared to aged care workers. So I think in this particular context, we're actually grappling with those longer standing problems of supply in the industry and of the quality of work. The security of work is generally casual. For example, people might not have predictability of shifts, which means people don't have predictability of income, which doesn't appeal in terms of planning your life and so on. So I think there's some of those fundamental things that are sort of national, but then we're all dealing with on a state and territory basis as well. I don't know, I haven't read much kind of analysis from health policy people about whether that's going to happen with people going to Victoria instead of being here. So I'm not sure how that will affect Tassie, but it will be, I guess the upside is perhaps that then puts pressure on for a similar scheme to be introduced here. So that's, again, maybe an option, a policy option or
Maybe
a policy
even more
solution.
maybe more tertiary education.
That's right. Well, big announcement about TAFE today, so that's exciting.
All right, that's very exciting. That's good. Now, I might ask one of the second question posed by Hobart College, which takes us to a kind of different aspect of it, but I think also important. It talks about preventative effective measures to protect those in care, but by looking at the mechanisms in place to ensure that individuals who fail to ensure this protection, and the question is who are those individuals, there's a question about that, are punished or somehow, there are some consequences for failing to provide adequate care.
Yeah, and thank you for that question as well. That's touched on another really big issue in this space, and particularly in relation to restrictive practices, but also more broadly. And we find it too in mental health, and we find it in disability services legislation, which is there aren't consequences for these actions, generally speaking. There may be consequences for the aged care provider, the facility, in terms of there's sort of a potential perhaps for people to be subject to more frequent inspections, for example. Eventually, if the quality of care falls below a particular level, then that can affect the facility's accreditation, which means they can't run as an aged care facility anymore, and they can't get funding to run that service. So there are those sorts of consequences, but we
What
don't.
about individuals that say children whose parents are in care, they've noticed that their parents do have bruises or are harmed in some other way, are not being fed or undernourished, what can they do?
Not a lot.
Yeah.
They can, they could technically, for example, pursue that under criminal law as a matter of assault and so on. We don't particularly see that happening. What's curious about it is it's a bit of a legal grey area, and so I think a lot of what happens in relation to this is just that we have strangely a sort of social, cultural acceptance of these sorts of practices against people that, as I said, are sort of in facilities that are away from the public eye. Unless we have an older relative to visit in an aged care facility, we don't generally perhaps volunteer there, but we don't generally go to those places. And also because there are these legal mechanisms that restrictive practices are permitted where someone is at risk of harm to themselves or at risk of harming others. Generally, there's sort of enough of a grey area to make the case that that's what's happened, for example.
It may be necessary.
Yeah, that it may be necessary. We have in common law a necessity of defence. So essentially, it's just something that is generally not pursued as a criminal matter, and that the legislation, the Aged Care Act, our Mental Health Acts and Disability Services Acts just don't go there. And there is, from the worker perspective, I've sort of touched on, there is an argument, or there is an element there that it is not fair that the individual worker on a very low wage who doesn't have enough other people involved and who has been told in a policy that this is permitted to then be the one.
Or not be trained.
Exactly, or not being trained to then be the one who is responsible. But it does create this huge justice problem in this area.
Should the management of the institution be kind of liable for the actions of its? Because if there was a greater risk of them being held liable, they would start to pay attention very quickly, I think, to doing the right thing.
And I should say another aspect there, so there's another Royal Commission, the Disability Royal Commission going on at the moment, and one thing that's come out in that, but also in a lot of stories of people with disability, particularly people with intellectual disability and cognitive impairment over many years, is that there's a problem for them of being taken seriously as a witness as well, in terms of the police might not consider you to be reliable, not to be telling the truth. Perhaps the police don't have processes to interview people with intellectual disability and so on, older people with dementia, which then means making a case, even if you were to mount a criminal case, is much more difficult.
So I was thinking, I don't know if there is or there should be a kind of ombudsman or complaint structure where people could make a complaint and that body has some kind of investigatory powers. Does that exist or should it exist?
Yeah, and so it's it doesn't work that way with aged care at the moment. There are bodies where you can make those complaints, and there are, like I said, there's more monitoring now by a regulatory body of the use of these practices, so they're a bit more aware now of, they can get they can now understand which particular facilities are using these practices more than others, for example, which can at least help regulators to sort of focus on where there might be issues that need to be addressed. For example, Victoria has a mental health complaints commissioner, which is along those lines, where people can make complaints about their treatment in mental health inpatient units. There are criticisms of that body for that it can't do a lot. It doesn't have particular powers to seek redress for individuals, and certainly people generally report that they don't feel that they've got sort of just outcomes, which then kind of has negative flow-on effects in terms of your future use of services and how you feel in the place that you live and where you're getting care and so on. So I think that's, I don't think that was particularly recommended by the Royal Commission. Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure why. As I say, I think partly it's to do with who would be responsible, and it would be a huge thing to make criminal responsibility, sort of put it on the table here. But there are certainly arguments, and so particularly from a human rights perspective, there are arguments that you absolutely need to have that. A, as an incentive to reduce and eliminate the practices, and B, to give people who've been harmed the opportunity to seek redress.
That's, I think, what the question was asking. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, up the back, you've got a question. Nice and loud.
So there was a report or like statement that was released by Anthony Albanese, and he said that he was having a plan to fix the aged care crisis over 4 years, and it said that it would cost $2.5 billion, but that's not including the increase of wages. Where do you think that money is going to go, and how do you think it can be resolved?
Thank you. Good question. So $2.5 billion committed over 4 years for changing the aged care system. If it's not going to wages, where is it going? Good question.
Because I think Labor said that they were going to foot the bill for the wages, but where would that, like, where do you think that money would go in fixing it as a whole when it's, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how much useful response I have for that. I mean, part of it will be setting up some of these structures that we've just been speaking about. So in terms of if you're going to have, because one big criticism one thing that came out and that was known for years and years beforehand was essentially the accrediting body that checks the quality of care that's provided in aged care facilities. They have a power to inspect, and they're sort of required to check the quality of care, but they were never doing sort of surprise visits, so facilities would always have a warning, for example, that they were coming, so if there were any problems with paperwork, for example, or conditions or whatever it was, staffing, they could be dealt with, you roster more people on for that week, that kind of thing. And so there's going to be a shift in that sort of monitoring stuff. Setting up those institutions will be expensive, so I expect that would be a large part of it. Law reform in itself is quite expensive in terms of getting it done. The other thing they've been speaking about a bit, and it will all add up, but the other thing that's come out really as a huge issue is the issue of nutrition. And so facilities sort of having tiny budgets for people's food, and terrible examples of people having like 3 party pies for lunch and dinner every day and not kind of having adequate nutrition, let alone like interesting and enjoyable food to eat. And so all those kinds of things are going to have to be dealt with as well. I think there's been a commitment for something like $10 per person per day or something along those lines. And that really...
What does that sound like, $10 a day?
Yeah. Even on sort of scale is interesting. So I think it's probably just that there's a whole lot of stuff to do. It'll be interesting to see, and I expect that part of the reason that wages aren't included in that number is that it would make that number huge, and that's going to be a work in progress as well.
Do you think some of it will go to ongoing increase in subsidisation for aged care?
Yeah,
It has to be that, surely.
Yeah, I mean, Again, there's a lot of wrangling around that in terms of who should be responsible, and there's sort of complications with a whole bunch of other areas of law in terms of should people be required to sell their family home, for example, to pay for their aged care, if for example their spouse still lives in that house. Things like people who are on an aged pension, what proportion of their pension should go to the aged care facility, how much should they be able to keep aside for enjoyable life things. If people are anything like my grandparents were, for giving me $50 every time I turned around for no particular reason, that sort of thing. If all those questions about who pays, and the extent to which individuals and families can be required to pay is one of the big questions I think that we don't know the answer to yet.
So your book title is Care and Support Rights After Neoliberalism. I think what we've talked about today is very much the neoliberal model and the kind of tinkering or patchwork that we can do within that model to make both the services a little better and to have greater supervision. But is there another model? Can we think outside? I like to always ask my students, can we think in really revolutionary thoughts? The world hasn't always been this way. It won't stay this way. We can imagine something different. What could we imagine different?
That's a good question. One thing that's difficult in this area is often when we try to imagine something different, we imagine the way things used to be. And the way things used to be was mostly that wages were high enough that one member of a nuclear family could be in employment, and that was enough for the whole family, which meant that the other member, again generally a woman, was at home providing care for children and providing care for older relatives with disability and so on. For a whole range of reasons, as we know, that is no longer the case, including that 2 incomes are generally required for a nuclear family household. Women want to be in the workforce, generally speaking, in much greater numbers than previously they were. So we're not going to kind of go back. In a way, it's kind of appealing, this idea of going away from these big institutional settings. So there's certainly more pressure, I suppose, to get rid of big places, again, like I said, that are sort of away from the community, separate from the community, where people are more likely to become disconnected and lonely, and there isn't this sort of oversight of what's happening in people's lives. So I think in terms of trying to imagine what's next, it's trying to imagine what it looks like as a community, I suppose, for it to be more normal for us to see one another's lives progress and to acknowledge that we all give and receive care and support in different ways and to different extents, different times in our lives. What comes along with that is things like we place more value on that, which means we pay people better for meeting those needs. It means things like we place value on it in our work, so it's more normal to take leave from work to provide care for an older relative or children and so on. Work is more flexible around that, and we've seen with COVID and working from home, I think a lot of interesting innovations there and changes with the way we kind of fit work and life together. So I think a lot of it is that sort of stuff around changing how we view needing care as something that's normal and giving it to others as something that's normal. And then there's a lot to do, like you say, in terms of the models that we have, the market-based models that are about profit and so on. And just we need to have more of a conversation about whether that's sustainable.
Because it does seem kind of strange that we have a market, we buy and sell care services, and people profit from that. It's a long way from that older model you described, where care would have been provided within a family across generations.
Yeah, and so the ideal, I think, is that people have choices, right? Or options rather than choices. So choices sometimes implies choices of what to purchase, whereas options is a bit broader in terms of if you want to live at home, what needs to happen so that the family members around you have time and support to care for you. If you want to live in a facility, what does a facility that's safe
Different
and
choices.
quality look like? You know, for example, you might want to live somewhere small, you might want to live somewhere in your community rather than having to move. People in regional areas often have to move a long way from family to get aged care. So just diversity, which came out really strongly in people giving evidence to the Royal Commission. And I think one thing that kind of is perhaps going to foster those kinds of changes is that we're sort of moving out of the era or moving into the era where the baby boomer generation are more and more getting into that aged care age bracket and are much more than the generation before them, are much more adept, I suppose, at designing things the way they want them and at
That's interesting. Demanding it.
yeah, and that sort of thing. And I think that has a lot of potential then for people to be really innovative in designing the care that they use and the communities that they want. So that'll be interesting too.
Yeah. Any final comments or questions from the group? Yes.
There's an interesting approach, I think it's in the Netherlands, sort of TV of giving younger people the option of living in a place with people who need care, and in return for like free rent or whatever, they have 10 hours a week they work in the place there, which is a really interesting approach, which is not trying to say we need to go back to the 50s, it's rather saying, how do we reintegrate older people who need care to the community, and at the same time meet the needs of people who need work or stuff. So those sort of approach stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good one. And I think it has rolled out in quite a few places since then. So often university students will live with an older person and it's sort of free board.
Yeah.
And we do sort of the work around the house kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And that sounds like it works really well. And the new ABC series that started the other night, Old People's Home for Teenagers, it's not quite that. I thought it was going to be that model, but it's not. But it's sort of similar about forging those connections between people who are 14, 15, 16 and people in their 70s, 80s, and I think the oldest person is 93. And just sort of that return, like you say, to those, or moving forward to those kinds of connected communities and so on, that maybe there are ways that we've lost, I think has heaps of potential as well.
Okay, well, I think you will join with me. I think you will join with me in thanking Yvette for a really, really informative session. And I want to thank you all for your engagement and for your really wonderful questions. And obviously this is going to be, this topic that you've chosen is something that is not very easily addressed. It is going to be something that you can engage with in many years to come. Okay, let's thank you.